What we've gone on for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. We pointed out Wednesday night that Hebrews is about things that are what? Better. Better is used 13 times in the book. And so you have the superiority of the new over the old, with a secondary application. Don't do what? Don't go back. Don't go back into the old. You've got the final. And really, the doctrinal aspect of the letter goes through chapter 10, about 18, and then in 19 he begins the practical applications, drawing near. And as we mentioned Wednesday night, if we sin willfully, there remains no more a sacrifice for sin. God has no part B. There's no plan B. If you reject what he has now, there's nothing more to come. And it's interesting that in the 10th chapter, in verses 32 through the end, he calls their attention back to when they were converted. The sacrifices he calls on them to remember, look, this is what you thought about the gospel then, in the new covenant. And then he goes back in chapter 11, and he goes farther on back, not only for you at the beginning, but all of your illustrious Jewish brethren, starting with Abel, and then going all the way down to Gideon, Barak, Samson, the prophets. All of it is, we mentioned this in passing Wednesday night, the context really helps us to appreciate even more than just say Hebrews 11 is about the faithful. Here were brethren who were thinking about going away from the gospel, going back into Judaism. And he's saying, look, your Old Testament illustrious fathers were looking toward what you have now. Don't give it up. And as great as their faith was, they were looking for, by faith, Noah being warned of God concerning things not seen as yet. The flood was in the future. By faith, Abraham obeyed to go out into a land which he was to receive, future, for an inheritance. He went out not knowing where he went. All of that's looking forward. And so that's, faith is assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. Yeah, okay. So, and then in 12, he talks about the fact that since all these illustrious people in your past stand in their faith as such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight, and then the sin that does so easily beset us. Contextually, the sin that does so easily beset us would be what? Yeah, disbelief. Faith, that's what we just talked about. And so he said, now, you've not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. And he calls on attention to that. And then 14 of 12, follow after peace with all men, the sanctification without which no man shall see the Lord. Don't be like Esau, and there's a great lesson there. Esau basically gave it, sold his birthright for a mess of what? Beans, yeah. And he says, that's what you're doing if you sell out the gospel for the old law. You don't do that. You made a bad bargain. And then you're not yet come to a mount that might be touched. You're not come to Mount Sinai, but you're come to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to innumerable host of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn ones, the church of the firstborn. Now, it's not referring to Christ, but to all of us who have the superior privileges. The firstborn in the Old Testament had a double portion of the Father's inheritance. So you're the church, the collectivity of those who have the superior privileges in the gospel. 13, he closes with a number of duties, social duties, spiritual duties. Verse 7, remember them that had the rule over you, men that spoke unto you the word of God. Considering the issue of their life, imitate their faith. That's likely referring to whom? Who are those spiritually who have the rule over you? Elders, yeah. In verse 17, I think also is a reference. Obey them that have the rule over you. And here's an interesting thing that I was thinking as I was studying this morning for our class. Verse 13, let us therefore go forth unto him with, verse 12, wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people through his own blood, suffered without the gate. That is, where they took him to Calvary, that was outside the gate of the city of Jerusalem. But then he uses that same idea but makes a figure of speech out of it. Let us therefore go forth unto him without the camp, bearing his reproach. Let's get out of Judaism and bear whatever reproach is necessary for us to maintain our faithfulness to the Lord. Beautiful, beautiful imagery there. All right, comment or question on Hebrews? Okie doke. We've made the comment before. Hebrews is similar to Galatians and Romans, parts of 2 Corinthians, from the point of view that you have a great contrast between the covenants. And if people can understand those three books, Galatians, Romans, and Hebrews, and parts of 2 Corinthians, parts of 4 books, I guess, you can get a bigger picture of the whole scheme of redemption. James, what's it about? Anybody? Trials. Yeah, trials do what they...
Growth through trials.
That's right, growth through trials. And I think the theme is seen in 2 and 3. Count it all joy when you fall into manifold trials, that the proving of your faith works patience or steadfastness, and lets patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, lacking in nothing. And then he goes on in chapter 1 that, don't think that your trials, your temptations come from God. God cannot be tempted with evil, neither tempteth he any man. But every man is taken away or drawn away by his own lust and enticed, and so on. So there's a temptation maybe to blame God. Temptation also to, in verse 21, not receiving the word, being hearers of the word, but not what? Verse 22. Doers. And then he talks about hearing and doing. Chapter 2 is about, there's a temptation sometimes to become what? I'm thinking of the P word. Prejudice. Partial. Someone you like, or someone who has, in the context, maybe a gold ring and some clothing, and you tell them to sit in different places in the assembly. Don't do that. Then there's also the temptation, as he says in 14 through the end, that you can have faith but not couple it with what? Works. And then in chapter 3, there's a temptation to not to control our what? Our tongue. And then in 4, the temptation to be worldly minded. Adulteresses and adulterers, know you not that friendship with the world is enmity with God. And then toward the end, our treatment of brethren. And our sometimes there's the tendency to think that we've got our whole life. We can kind of designate when we're going to die. Come now, ye that say today or tomorrow we'll go into town and buy and sell, get gain. You don't know what's on the morrow. For your life is but a what? A vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord wills, we'll do this or that. And so it's in that context that he says in verse 17, I think it is, to him therefore that knoweth to do good and doeth it not is sin. That is, you're not considering God forefront in your life and God's will in that point. And then chapter 5, he talks about the relation between riches and people who have riches sometimes, and then be patient. And he illustrates that in 7 through about 11. There's a temptation to, when somebody maybe questions our truth, or the truthfulness of our words, to do what in verse 12? To swear. Yeah. And when we're suffering, let us pray. If we're cheerful, let us sing praise. Confess various duties here toward the end. It's interesting, 19 and 20, the conclusion of James. My brethren, if any among you err from the truth and one convert him, let him know that he who converts a sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death, that is, the soul who needed to be converted, and shall cover a multitude of sins, not his own, but the ones that he tries to convert. Yeah, Brother Charlie, you wanted to say something? Okay, James who wrote this book was the brother of Jesus. Yeah, a servant and he doesn't say that. He just says a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. to the 12 tribes which are the dispersion. James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Jude are often called what kind of epistles? General epistles, because they were not written to any specific church, no specific individual, but generally to the 12 tribes which are of the dispersion and so on. All right, in 1 Peter, real quickly now, our last epistle, Peter, can somebody tell me what the overall message of 1 Peter is?
Hope in suffering.
Hope in suffering. That's really good. It's similar to James in that he talks about the fact that you're going to have suffering here, but you have hope, and it will end up in your being glorified. That's seen really in the first chapter, verse 6, 7, and 8, wherein ye greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been put to grief in manifold trials, that the proof of your faith, that's similar to James, being more precious than gold that perishes, though it's proved by fire, may be found unto praise, glory, honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Praise, glory, and honor. So you have difficulties now, but you have hope that you'll be glorified in the future. And that seems to be an idea that goes all the way through the book. The word suffering is mentioned, I think, some 17, I counted it, 17 times some form of the word suffer or suffering is mentioned in it. Chapter 2 is interesting, kind of a continuation of an idea. There we're born, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible. And then in chapter 2, after we're born, verse 2, as newborn babes, we need to do what? Long for the spiritual milk to grow. And as we grow, we become, as it were, building or blocks in the spiritual house of God, verse 5. And we don't need to stumble around on all of this. We're an elect race, a royal priesthood, verse 9. Specific, the general behavior among Gentiles is mentioned in 11 and 12. I beseech you as sojourners and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul, that our behavior might be comely or seemly among the Gentiles. And then that behavior is specified in 13, really down, we might say down through chapter 3, verse 12. Who is under discussion in 13 through 17? Our relation to whom? To government. 18 to the end. Servants and masters. 3, 1 through 6. Yes, wives toward husbands. And primarily wives whose husbands are not Christians. 7, husbands toward wives. And then 8, down through 12 at least.
Suffering for the sake of righteousness.
Yes, and really our relation toward all. Be ye all like-minded, compassionate toward each other. And 13 through 5 verse 14 is a suffering for the Lord. If we suffer for the Lord, we're to be counted as how? What? Blessed. That's right. Blessed, favored by God. And we're to sanctify, that is set apart in our hearts, Christ as Lord. He's our master. We're to set him apart as our master. And being ready to answer everyone that asks us a reason of the hope that's within us, yet with meekness and fear. He continues that idea through the teaching that we know, everybody in this audience would know, verse 21, that the life figure whereunto even baptism doth also now save us. But it's in view of the fact that just as, backing up, it's better, verse 17, if the will of God should so will that you suffer for well-doing, because Christ did. Christ suffered in order to do right, that good might follow from his actions. Just like Noah and the flood, Noah and his family. Noah preached to those people who are now in prison in Hadean realm, but who were disobedient in the days of Noah when the ark was preparing, wherein few, that is 8 souls, were saved by water, which is a true likeness that now saves us even baptism. But it's all predicated on the fact that Jesus was, end of 21, was raised from the dead. And then he continues, as Christ also suffered, you arm yourselves with the same mind that Christ had, and things will be better for you. But don't let suffering interfere with your duties to do right. 7 through 11. Your commands are still there. Be sober, prayer, fervent in your love, hospitality without murmuring, ministering as good stewards, speaking as the oracles. A lot of participial phrases there. And then you ought not to think that suffering really is a what in verse 12? Is a what kind of a thing? Strange thing, yeah. It's not strange, kind of like 1 Timothy 4. If any man be godly in Christ Jesus, he shall suffer persecution. If any man lives godly in Christ Jesus. And so he ends that idea with suffering as Christians. One of the 3 times the word Christians is used. Let no man suffer as a thief or a meddler in other men's matters. But if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but glorify God in this name. And then 5, he deals with various exhortations, particularly to whom, the first few verses? Elders. Peter calls himself a what? A fellow elder and witness. I'll bring that back up in our study, Lord willing, just a moment. All right, and then some final exhortations. Silas or Silvanus, our faithful brother, as I've written you briefly, that this is the true grace of God. She that is in Babylon, elect together. Mark was with Peter. Some say, well, Babylon was a code name for Rome. It may have been in Revelation, but I'm not certain it is here. There's good evidence that Peter actually went to way over into Babylon, and that it's not used in any kind of a metaphorical way. Comment or question? Okie doke. Let's go back to John 21. John 21. We did not do any of our questions, but we talked and read through all of chapter 21 of John, Jesus' appearance to the 7. We want to remember where we are. We have been in John. I've added this little text box. John 20 and 21 record the three appearances, at least 3 appearances here. First, to the 10th, well, actually John 20 records more than that. Mary Magdalene, and then to the 10 apostles and others with them, a Sunday evening in Jerusalem. That was on Resurrection Day. That's in John 20. And Thomas is not with them. And then to all the apostles the following Sunday, and in Jerusalem, and Thomas is with them. And then now in John 21 to the 7 disciples fishing by the Sea of Galilee. Sometime in the time of that's unknown. This is where we've been, and here's where we are now. The next appearance will be to above 500 at once that Paul alludes to in 1 Corinthians 15, which could be the same as the one mentioned in Matthew 28, where he gives the account of the Great Commission, according to Matthew. He appears to all the apostles at the end of 40 days on the Mount of Olives. Likely that's Luke 24, and that corresponds to Acts 1. Could be Mark 16. I'm not certain about that. And last of all, he appeared then to all the apostles. Paul said 1 Corinthians 15. And then a little later, a few years later, last of all, he appeared to me as the child untimely born, 1 Corinthians 15:8. And we pointed out that most of the appearances have been here in Jerusalem, but now he's up in Galilee, and all of that was according to prearrangement. All right. And this is something I did not have earlier. In 20, Jesus appears to in 21, Jesus appears to the 7 disciples by the sea, offers them breakfast. Then we have the conversation between Jesus and Peter, his prediction concerning Peter, and Peter's I found it difficult to get a good word for that. His reinstatement. Actually, he was never uninstated, but he's reinstated or restored, seemingly with the conversation the Lord had with him. And then Peter says, he looks around, John's behind them. What about John? What's going to happen to him? And so Jesus gives a statement and that answer relative to John. And then he clears up a misunderstanding about it. Then the concluding testimony and its certainty about what he wrote. He was there. He knew what of that he wrote. Of course, he was inspired. All right, let's answer some questions. On the bottom of 135, I mentioned in the note, it's difficult to know for certain the order of Jesus' appearances during these 40 days, or even where they occurred. The last appearance to the apostles and Thomas just studied was while the apostles were still in Jerusalem, likely the upper room. However, this appearance we now study was sometime later, and the apostles and other disciples were in Galilee, not Jerusalem. All right, and then next paragraph. Mark's account of the Great Commission seems to be on the same occasion when Jesus convinced Thomas that he was alive. It's evident that the commission, according to Matthew, was given after the disciples had returned to Galilee. Some place Paul's reference to Jesus' appearance to above 500 brethren at once at the same time of Matthew's account, since Matthew mentions that when he appeared, some doubted. The apostles did not doubt by that time, but some among the 500 may have. Paul's reference to a separate appearance to James, likely the Lord's brother, in 1 Corinthians 15:7. Next page, Luke's account of the commission seems to be just before he ascended back to heaven in Acts 1. And so, as we pointed out, Acts is almost like a sequel to Luke, since Luke wrote both, and picks up in Acts where he leaves off in Luke. Therefore, it's impossible to be certain beyond any doubt how many separate appearances Jesus made. Significant matter is that these appearances constituted sufficient evidence to convince all honest-hearted people of his resurrection by many infallible proofs Luke recorded. Some have called John 21 the epilogue, concluding section that rounds out the purpose of a literary work, showing a symmetry to its beginning, which was the prologue in the first 18 verses of chapter 1. It seems the purpose of the chapter is to show how belief of the disciples should be applied. It's interesting, he sets out in chapter 1 to show that in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that hath been made. And then when he comes down to about verse 6, he talks about how John came to bear witness. He was not the light, but he came to bear witness of the light. It's interesting that he starts in John 1 with introducing Jesus as the Son of God and John the Baptist as the one who would bear witness to the light. He concludes with evidences to show Jesus is the Son of God, and Peter and the other apostles, for that matter all of us, need to move on all of that. And then he concludes verses 24 and 5 with his identification of himself, and that we know that all things that we've said are true. And so it's kind of like a bookends rather, from the establishment of his deity and the witness of it with John the Baptist to the proof of his deity in chapter 21 and the final nail in the coffin of his own testimony. He testifies his own testimony is true in essence. We have gone through really all that I mentioned in the observations and questions on page 136. We'll come back to that maybe a little later. Let's just go on into question number 1. Jesus now manifested himself again to the disciples at the Sea of, what's it called here? Tiberias. Tiberias was a city that was, if you're looking at the map of, no, I'm not going to take time to go back. You know it well. Here's Capernaum, Chorazin, Bethsaida, 11, 12, 1 o'clock on the idea of if you lose your hand as the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum's over here about 11 o'clock. Tiberias is like 9 o'clock if you look at the Sea of Galilee as a map. Tiberias was a city that had been devoted to the Caesar. And so oftentimes, just like the Tennessee River over in Gunnersville is known as what lake? Gunnersville Lake. Guess what it's known of over in Florence, between Florence and Athens? Wheeler Lake, same body of water, but known by a different place. Sometimes bodies of water take on a city's name, or the Sea of Galilee, that's the province around it. The Sea of Kinnereth or Kinnereth, the idea that it was heart-shaped, and also the Greek form of the Hebrew Kinnereth is Gennesaret. So it was known as the Lake of Gennesaret. So it had about 4 names, and that's really the next thing that we've got. It was also called the city of, it was called this because of the city of Tiberias, which was on its shores. The body of water was actually known by 4 names in the scripture. First, the one above, Sea of Tiberias. Then it was called the Sea of what in Matthew 4:18? Yes, and the Lake of Gennesaret and the Sea of Kinnereth. Yes, in Joshua. It's known. That's an interesting idea too. The word Kinnereth depends on who you read after, but carries the idea of a harp, H-A-R-P, harp shaped. Well, if you look at the kind of the outline, of what the sea looked like, it kind of resembles that. Perhaps that's what it was named after. But the heart-shaped and the city and the sea were named after that also. All right, name the apostles mentioned, verse 2. David, what do you have for that?
Peter, Thomas, sons of Zebedee.
And two other disciples. Yeah, 2 other disciples. Good. All right. The next page. Peter takes the lead, as has been common. State what happens in verse 3. He told his friends, I go a-fishing. And the others agreed to come with him. By the time the sun arose, who was standing on the beach, and did they recognize who he was? Jesus. And no, it was just barely dawning, Jesus asked them, children or boys, have you aught to eat? This was like a stranger might address them. Boys, do you have anything to eat? Likely thinking this was a prospective customer, they sadly said, no. It's kind of reminiscent of Luke 5. We've toiled all night and caught nothing, but at thy word we'll go. What did Jesus suggest, and what was the result? Cast your net what? On the right side of the boat, and you will find. Who recognized Jesus on the shore at this time? John, yes, and had a note. John, having believed in the resurrection even before he had seen the risen Lord, may rightly be presumed to have had a livelier expectation of meeting him in Galilee, and this expectation may have made him more alert for signs of the Lord's presence. When Peter heard that it was the Lord, what did he do? Yeah, he girded his coat about him, and then what? Went into the sea. Yeah, and this note that I put, I felt like I want everybody to understand this. That's why I wrote it out. The word naked, some of your newer translations will say he was stripped for work. Do you have a translation that says that? He was stripped for work. Other translations will say he was naked. And I mentioned it signifies unclothed or scantily or poorly clad, with worn garments, clad in undergarment only, the outer being laid aside. Vine says in his word, in his definition of the word, naked. It's interesting that what Peter put on, his coat, was an upper garment where it apparently denotes a kind of linen frock which fishermen wore when at work. Again, Vine on the word clothing. Therefore, for a time, Peter was without his upper body being clothed and was considered naked or stripped. But before jumping into the sea to swim to Jesus, he put his clothes, something like a shirt, on. Very different from modern swimwear, as well as conceptions about what constitutes being naked. McGarvey comments that Peter was moved by reverence and respect for the master, though it encumbered him greatly in his efforts to swim. I find a lot of people thinking, men can go around without their shirts and that's okay. We just need to be covered up. We just need to be covered up. Driving a bunch of girls on a field trip about 2 weeks ago, Got off at Green Springs Avenue. We were going north on 65. Got off. We're going to the Crossplex. There's a bunch of track girls. Well, you know where you are there in Green Springs, like you're going toward Elmwood. You got some people who you don't know if they're all there or not. There was this guy, probably 20, I'd say early 20s. Long hair, smoking, didn't have a shirt on. Guess what I heard? What did I hear? What was that, Brother Gene?
Giggles.
Giggles. Girls getting up on one side of the bus, moving to the other so they could see him. And I told them, I got on the PA, I said, this is not the kind of character you want to date or marry. And, but it made a very, very point. You get a guy who, and he was in pretty decent shape, he didn't have any fat on him for sure. And all of a sudden, girls are Google-eyeing him, you know. Guys need to wear clothes, wear shirts. And I'll tell you what now, also with the homosexual stuff that's going on, the lesbian, all the more reason to be covered. And Peter was, he put on his clothes to go swimming, didn't he? As well as to meet the Lord. I think that's a valid point in our culture. Okay. When I was growing up, sometimes in some of you my age or older, you might remember this. If you had PE, and sometimes the PE instructor would ask the guys to just wear their shorts, you know, or maybe real skimpy shorts. You know, in the 70s, shorts for guys, PE shorts were a whole lot skimpier than they are now, even. But anyway, the point I was going to make. There were provisions made in most schools that if you had a conscientious objection to wearing what was considered, or what the PE instructor wanted, you had a conscientious problem with that. If you received a note, or if you could get a note from a preacher or elder, somebody, you know, in some official in the church where you were, and give it to the instructor, you were exempt. Do y'all remember that? You remember that, Gene? Charlie, you remember that? Farron?
Where I went to school, if you didn't dress out, they cut you grade.
Yeah, but this was conscientiously opposed to wearing or disrobing to that fact. I was telling somebody that, it's been a year or so. He said, I never hear about that. I never hear anybody asking to have any kind of an exemption like that. Nobody has scruples about that, seems like. But it used to be common. And here's another idea, that the word exercise, 1 Timothy 4, but exercise thyself unto godliness, you know. Bodily exercise profiteth a little, but godliness is profitable for all things, having promise of the life that now is. That word exercise comes from a Greek word that, guess what we get our English word? Gymnasium, gymnos. And it means basically naked. Same idea here.
Philip, I can remember when if you were in gym and the board was playing against other boards, that's how they told you
Yeah,
apart.
shirts and skins.
Yes.
Yes, I was there. Shirts and skins. So you can tell if you're throwing a pass or a basketball, yeah.
Now, we did have girls that had objections because they weren't allowed to wear pants.
Yeah.
And some, or shorts. So they would wear long skirts, even in the band uniform.
Yes.
For some girls that had objections, they let them wear long skirts.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that way, they did in that.
Yes, that's right. I don't know if they make any exceptions in band now. I think they do. There's more of a uniformity, pardon the pun. All right, number 10. Remember that a cubit was approximately 1 1/2 foot. This is the older translations that use 300, I don't mean that, 200 cubits it mentions. How far was the boat from the shore then? How many feet? About 300. I measure things, David, I'm sure you do. Some of the rest of you play ball. I measure things in like a football field's length. I can really picture things if I get roughly 100 yards. I know about, I feel like I can step off and I'll be right on 40. I know about 40, 50. Most of us do. And, but you take 300 feet, the length of a football field, when it's barely daylight, just getting, can you really see? Well, no, you can't. If it's just bare, you can't tell from one end of the football field to another if it's just who it is, you know, because of that. And that's the way it was with them. But John recognized, what had Jesus already prepared when they reached shore? Number 11? Yes, a fire with fish and bread. This sight gave a new meaning to the Lord's question, verse 5. He had not come to buy, but to supply. It's interesting also what kind of a fire. We'll come back to this in a little bit. A charcoal fire. The King James American Standard says a fire of coals. A fire of coals. There's a Greek word that's only used here, as well as in chapter 18, verse 18. Anthrakion, from which we get anthracite. Anthracite coal. Yeah. And so likely what that was, though, was not coal. It was likely wood. Charcoal is basically wood that has had the burned, it's been heated without oxygen and makes a type of charcoal. Coke is the equivalent of, you know, when coal is burned without oxygen, it removes any of the moisture and whatnot. It becomes coke. And
That burns hotter.
what's that?
That burns hotter.
It burns hotter, right, and less smoke. It's interesting that that different word for fire. That's a word that we get like pyromaniac, pyrus, or pyro. And here, and in John 18, verse 18, where Peter was standing around where there was a fire of coals made. That's where he did what? That's where warming his hands, and where he ended up denying the Lord. And it doesn't say it, but the two, based on the narrative that follows, it looks like Jesus is setting up a reminder for Peter, because at least that's how the narrative continues. And that same, it's almost like same kind of fire, remind him of all that. All right, number 12. Jesus told them to bring of the fish that which you've now taken. How many were there? 153. What's also stated that seems to be a part of the miracle also, different from what happened in Luke 5. Good, okay, the net was not rent or torn. Picture the scene. It's very early in the morning, just around dawn. Apostles had been fishing all night. As the sun slowly rises, they see a man on shore about 100 yards away. He asks them if they have anything to eat. When they say they don't, he tells them to fish from the right side of the boat. Immediately, they have more fish than they can take care of. God identifies the man on shore as Jesus. Peter dives in and swims to shore, and then the others negotiate the boat with all the fish back to shore. Remember, it's still early morning, likely quiet. What do they not ask Jesus, and why? Who he was. And why? They knew he was the Lord. Yeah. They ate, that's right. They eat breakfast together, indicating what again about Jesus? He was physically risen from the dead. It's an interesting thing. Jesus, his physical body was raised so he could meet with them in the physical, natural way. The Bible teaches that in 1 Corinthians 15, that we will be raised, but when we are raised, it won't be a physical body. It's going to be changed into a spiritual body that's adequate to clothe our spirits. And so, yet the physical body of Jesus being raised gives us faith that whatever he says about our body being raised and changed, then that will occur as well. So you can kind of keep the differences there. Number 16 at the bottom. Which time was this that Jesus had appeared to the apostles? The third, yes. And he mentions that specifically. The others as a group on a Sunday night without Thomas and so on. Next page, we have a division here. Verses 15 through 23 describe a conversation between Jesus and Peter. What name does Jesus call him? Simon, son of John, yes. Noting John 1:42, why might Jesus have referred to Peter by that original name? Keep in mind how the rest of the conversation progresses. Well, he refers back to
Unbelievers.
good. Yes, he's challenging his commitment to the Lord. He goes back to what Peter's name was before Jesus said, your name's not going to be any longer Cephas, but the rock. Yeah, yeah. Several interesting things about this, but the key to its significance surrounds Peter's denial of Jesus when he was on trial. During the Passover, Peter had boasted of his love toward Jesus being superior to that of all other disciples. If everybody leaves you, Lord, I'm not. I'll even die for you. Even if Peter had to die with him, he would not deny him. Yet Jesus had warned and predicted that before the cock crew, Peter would deny him thrice. Now when Peter hears from John that it's Jesus on shore, he dives into the water, leaving the other apostles to make do for themselves, swims to meet him. Perhaps Peter is trying to make good on his earlier claims. Time had come for the restoration of Peter. Probing was designed to impress the wavering disciple with the need for more caution and less boasting of his strength in the hour of trial. After they had eaten, what did Jesus ask Peter? Lovest thou me more than these? And we've already talked about this, the more than these what? The fishing business, the other disciples. Do you love me more than they love me? Maybe as a comparison. Likely that's the idea. You love me more than these love you. Though the fishing business would apply. After Peter's reply, what did Jesus command him to do? Feed my lambs. A second time, what did Jesus ask and what did he omit in this question? Lovest thou me, and what did he omit? More than these. Do you just love me? Agapao, the selfless love, sacrificial love. Peter answers as he did at first. What does Jesus now instruct him? Tend my sheep. Yeah, and I mentioned in the note, likely the difference between lambs and sheep might be the variation of ages that Peter would have responsibility for trying to teach. Third question appears to be the same. However, Jesus uses a different Greek word, the same word Peter's been using for his answer. In essence, Jesus says, Peter, do you even have a warm feeling for me that you claim to have? Agapao, then phileo. And Peter, what did that cause him, Peter, when he said that? Yeah, he was grieved. He was grieved. Now, he said, feed my sheep, tend my lambs. So there's an implication in what Jesus said that I'm forgiving you and you have work to do in the future. But by the third time, there's a suggestion to Peter, maybe the Lord is what? Do you even have a warm feeling for me? Are you sure? Lee and I were talking about this. If Lee said to me, Philip, do you really love me? I said, Lee, you know I love you. Second time, Philip, do you love me? You know I love you. Third time, Philip, do you really love me? And then you almost feel like, why is she asking me this? She's almost doubting that I do. And there is that punch, that pin prick, as I know you, Peter. In fact, Peter, the third time, when he says he was grieved, then he said, Lord, I know that you, no, he said, Lord, thou knowest, oh, no, Peter, the third time, lovest thou me? Peter said, Lord, thou knowest all things. Thou knowest that I love thee. That's an interesting word there, Ido, rather than gnosko. You have complete understanding of my inner workings, of my thinking. You know me inside out. And you know I have this warm feeling for you. Gone was the boasting. Lord, if everybody leaves you, I'll never leave. In fact, I'll even die for you. Gone is that now. And it's more of a humbled Peter who says, Lord, you know I have a warm feeling for you. Well, I've got work for you to do. And then by the third time, he said, do you have that? Oh, Lord, you know, I know that you know all things. You know me inside out. Very, very humbling for Peter, and yet at the same time, it was therapeutic. It was restorative. Because here, the Lord basically, through implication, and feed my lambs, tend my sheep, is saying, Peter, you're reinstated. You're back with everybody. And so that's a part of it. Well, it's 18 after. We're going to have, yes, sir.
Third time he denied Christ, he cursed.
Cursed with, yeah.
So he got stronger.
Yes.
So Jesus had to cut him down, humble him more
Yeah.
to make up for that last time when he actually cursed, because his denials got worse.
Yes.
So his knowing had to get stronger.
Yes. Good point. You know, I mentioned this Wednesday night, and Lord willing, we'll finish out this coming Wednesday. And I had several lessons, combination applications from the whole chapter that I wanted to share. Some of it we've kind of talked a little bit about, but I'll tell you what, if this passage teaches anything more of an application, it is that we don't ever need to boast about what we're not going to do or what we will do. Never say never. We plan to serve the Lord. Like Jesus said, follow me. Twice to be, follow me. We plan to follow him in every way. Make it our commitment. But never be like Peter says. And in fact, Peter just say, Lord, you got that wrong. I'll never, Peter, you're going to deny me twice. Oh no, you're wrong about that. No. Let him that thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. All right, let's stop and Lord willing pick up with the final questions, and then we'll look at a few applications and then go on.